that you grouped up with, but I'm still going to be relying on y'all to share. What did that terminology mean to you, and why did you choose that label?
Well, personally, I'm from a California school. I'm from Cal State Northridge. So it's, at least for me, I found that it's easier to use the term AB 540 when you're expressing your status, rather than like just going, yeah, I'm undocumented. It's easier, and there's a lot of, even like professors use the term AB 540 instead of using the term undocumented. Like they have like, oh, it's an AB 540 free safe zone, so it's a little easier to have that conversation with people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for me, I'm also a California student, but during high school, being undocumented was really, difficult. I had to overcome a bunch of things, but then just seeing AB 540, it kind of was an inspiration to me. It just showed me like it kind of ensured me that I can go to college despite the fact that I don't have proper documentation. So,
yeah, thanks so much for sharing. And for those of you who are not coming from California, is this a relatively new term? Yeah. So you're nodding your head, but I do want to start with this because the literature shows us that this is one of the first terms that actually did the very thing that we're talking about in this session, which is to create a neutral labeling strategy that principally protects students. And it's derived out of the Assembly Bill AB 540, which allowed for students, very much like you all have shared was part of your own experience, to be able to speak to that particular lack of documentation without having to express a lot of the repercussions that would come in saying the other terms that we now use perhaps much more widely and freely. So the work of Leslie Abradel, for example, or Michael Livas, there's a lot of really helpful work that tells us about the intersections of language and how in society we utilize them in order to then create a sense of awareness, which was the first part of creating an undocumented movement that let others know that there are students, right, who are outside the purview of some of the rights, right? So, excellent, thank you. So now you know about AB 540. There is also another term that literature and this body of knowledge tells us about, and that is that of the 1.5 generation. So we had a little bit larger group of folks, so raise your hand if you affiliated as such, and tell us why you clustered around that, what that means to you.
So I didn't learn about this term until sophomore year in college. And most people, they tend to throw around the word first generation. I mean the legal first generation. But in the immigration process, we learned that, and my friend Rosa put this really nicely. She said that people who are first generation that come here as adults, they have certain experiences that immigrants that come when they're 5, 10, 11 years old, they have different experiences. And it's like this in-between of first generation and second generation. And someone also in the group mentioned that. And it's kind of like you feel like you're here, and at the same time you feel like you're there, here in the United States, and then there in the country that you're from when you came here when you were a child. And you're never fully American, and you're never fully where you came from. So then I feel like I'm not fully American, but at the same time I feel like I'm not fully Guatemalan, when you go back and forth.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much for sharing. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, actually the first time I heard of 1.5 generation had to actually do with Vietnamese immigrants in Louisiana. And once I found out exactly what that kind of meant, what it connotated, I was like, that's definitely my situation. Like, you're not necessarily, just how you were saying, you're not necessarily directly defined or absorbed by the American culture or the immigrant culture. So for me, the Mexican culture. But you're definitely influenced by the two growing up. So you never really know, you never know for certain where exactly you fit in that whole situation, but you definitely pick up on one side or the other at times. you're definitely in the margins, I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both for sharing, because that really does encompass what we know to be true. And Portes and Rombald, this work really highlights what you picked up from your peers, which is the sense of liminality that exists, and why this term exists is much more academic in a way, because it comes from folks who have looked at this idea of straddling both generations and not being able to fully ascribe to either one because of that positionality of coming in from perhaps a young age and having those bicultural mannerisms. And so this also, a neutral labeling strategy, signals, right, this idea of identifying with both being a bicultural youth and what we know to be true from this particular label is it really does feature this idea of assimilation with regards to mannerism, interests, aspirations, and again, straddling both of those generations. So thank you for sharing how that came to be. Was this one that other folks who didn't line up with this had heard about though? Okay, lovely. We're going to move next and highlight the evolution of the terminology that moves away from the first two and that captures this really fascinating element of what does it mean to be a dreamer, and the identity of that is really fascinating. So I'm going to start us first with the folks who self-described themselves and lined up in front of the chalkboard, and you said you were a dreamer. So this term, as you've seen, has come into much more popularity. Comes immediately, we know, from the terminology of the legislation, the Development, Education, and Relief for Alien Minors Act. Say that 3 times with me. But we now know that the connotations of it are expanded. So for those of you who are dreamers, go ahead and tell us what that means. Yes.
Okay, so I feel like for a lot of us, we just to give like a little, it was introduced to the Congress in 2001. And in 2010, it was also like reintroduced, but it failed. So for a lot of us, I think it just marks like, kind of like 2 things. Hope for change. It's like a constant reminder that this is what we want. We want a pathway to citizenship, and mostly because we want to go to school. And it also reminds us that this is where our dreams were put on hold. So I think this is why we identify, because we're still undocumented. We still can be part of the 1.5 generation, but I feel like it has like a deeper meaning to us because we do have dreams, and the word dream, like it's just, I guess for everyone it means different things, but for most of us, it's just what we relate to the most, just the American dream.
Yeah, and if you think about the positioning of this label versus illegal alien, right, the immediate consequence of that framing is it does create a positive rendition, one that has come with a lot of critique, but we want to hear from other folks who have identified as such.
So I graduated high school in 2012, and if you remember, that was the spring right before the announcement of DACA. And so the couple of years before I graduated, when I started looking into college, like how I was going to pay for college, looking for scholarships, I think like the majority of the resources I found were sort of gathered under the label of dreamer, because that was the only sort of label. And you know, I went to a high school where I hadn't told anyone that I was undocumented or anything like that. And on the internet, I think that's a term that was like the most used, so I think that's why I identified it, because this was a time when I started to realize sort of the repercussions that being undocumented would have on my financial aid, on, you know, the fact that I wasn't eligible for FAFSA, I think that's what it's called, or in some of the wording for the policy that some of the colleges I was looking at had. So I think that's when I started getting a sense of, you know, what it meant to be like undocumented and how it would affect my opportunities, and that's the label I think that was most common.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Because it becomes an immediate shorthand, right? That is an umbrella term for those who would be eligible for this bipartisan legislation. But it has come to mean much more than that, and what we have come to see is folks who have self-defined under dreamer. Also, there's a point of resonance with political efficacy and consciousness around the activism of this particular bill. Yes? And we can spend some more time. I know I see a couple hands, but because we want to be sensitive to the schedule, I want to make sure that we're able to feature the definitions to the other ones. So I want to make sure that we cover what, for those of you who said you were undocumented, really quickly, why that term? Yes?
For me, the word undocumented was how I was introduced to the idea of labeling oneself as something else apart from the word legal or anything of that sort. But the word undocumented, it's much more inclusive, because when you say that you're a dreamer, you're forgetting of the people that don't have the opportunity to go to school. When you're saying that you're documented, you're forgetting about those that don't have access to deferred action. Even as a California student, if I were to say that I'm an AB 540 student, I'm forgetting about those people that don't qualify for AB 540. So for me, undocumented is much more inclusive, and it's a reminder that it's not just about us as students. It's also about our families, about people that don't have access to educational opportunities, and much more.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Because part of that idea of using language is also to think about the strategies of, does this create a more comprehensive approach to what we're fighting for, right? And the idea of the critique for dreamers comes around the idea that this standalone bill could potentially come at the harm of the larger scope of the immigrant rights movement. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff that comes with that, but most generally what we're talking about here is the reference to a larger scope of folks that don't necessarily fit the criteria of when you came to the United States, what age you are, whether you have had the opportunity to go into the Army or into higher education. I think I saw your hand also.
Yeah, and so to what he said, I think like the word like dreamer or documented creates like a dichotomy between like what is a good immigrant and what is a bad immigrant, and like I think that it criminalizes parents, because I think when like politicians were like favoring legislation to help dreamers, it was always like saying how parents were to blame, not the children. And also to add to that, like, shoot, I forgot what my last point was, but it was, oh yeah, like I think United We Dream started this campaign about like our parents have dreams too, because I think it was interesting that the first person who talked about why they identify as dreamers is that we have dreams, but I think it's important to like not draw that distinction between like, or like what is more important, like because you're on the path to education, like, does that mean that it's more important than whatever dreams your parents have? I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for sharing. And again, we're trying to capture this continuum of what terminology has been used in the past and the present, and I really want us to have a understanding of what this label means so that we can also think about that question is what terminology is best serving the movement. And so what we also know about the undocumented term is this became part of the movement in that it's tried to feature, being undocumented and unafraid really featured the idea of being unauthorized and without status as part of the claiming for rights, and moves to do so do remove the stigma that immediately comes from this idea that I should not disclose my status because that is something, not only does it come with the consequences of deportation, but really using that to create a momentum and a sense of galvanization around that, that said, it is beneficial for folks to claim an undocumented status. And so under undocumented, even think about that umbrella. That movement looked at undocumented and unafraid, right? And it was about really featuring this idea of being without status, but it also moved into an even more agitative state that said, I am undocumented, right? I am unafraid. So the consequences that potentially come with the stigma of that, that is something that we're going to feature as part of the way that we mobilize for rights, and I'm unapologetic about it. And we move to the current and most recent iteration of this, and that is another term that brings in this idea of policy, right, and has come to create another distinctive possibility of the type of access or lack thereof. So how many of you came under the rubric of DACAmented? Where are you at? Yep.
I saw you.
Uh-huh.
Oh my goodness, nobody's talking. So So I chose this one. Well, like I am undocumented, like I fall under that category as well. But this is more specific to me just because I feel like I'm not undocumented when I have DACA. I mean, I am, but I can do a lot of things that with DACA, like driving, I can work, I can leave the country with advanced parole, I think it's called. And so I just feel like this is more specific to my situation currently.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing. And yes, that is a new terminology that is meant to emphasize being eligible for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, right? And then there's obviously certain characteristics that make one fall under this rubric, but this idea of if you are eligible for documented, you don't necessarily have to self-define as such because we're trying to get the range of different terms that exist as such. We also saw a huge number of folks who clustered on this particular realm. And so one of the things I wanted to also include into this conversation is the sphere of influence that everyone has, regardless of your own positionality with status, right? And then many of you said that you were allies, so what does that mean to be an undocu ally?
So I think like one of the most important parts, as like I was listening to the discussion and other people talk about it, was being well informed. I think when you're not undocumented, you kind of have the privilege of choosing whether or not to be informed on immigration issues, whereas somebody who is undocumented doesn't like necessarily like you. I feel like there's like a greater need to be informed about immigration issues. So I think being an ally means recognizing that that choice exists, but not just recognizing it, but then like making the active choice to inform yourself, not just like through the media and through other like scholarship, but also through like listening to people who are undocumented and elevating those voices. And then it's not, somebody in our group discussion said it's not just like about being informed, it's about translating what you learn into political choices.
Yeah, thanks for capturing that. Was there anybody else who also wants to share what that looks like?
So, I wasn't physically in the room to do the activity, but I self-identify as an ally, mostly because I am a green card holder now. So, in the space of allyship, I'm pretty privileged because I know firsthand like what it means like to live as an undocumented person and what it like is to live with a mixed status family and to live in Georgia and have to deal with that plus like this racist tension. And because of the privilege of having a green card, I no longer feel like it's the right place to identify myself as undocumented, even though like a green card doesn't take away like years of violence or like the social things that like go on in your mind. But yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing, because the issue around these categories is they are complex, right? And they do elicit different experiences that you all have had that have led to you all deciding to choose which station that you selected. And what we're looking at here when we're talking about allyship is we're really looking at this idea of what does that look like to support members of a group and really understand what that type of disenfranchisement has been, and really start to think about where are those places where this type of invested work, and even we argue the feature of the type of terminology, right, that is sensitive, that becomes an important piece of having this dialogue. The undocu-friendly piece and how much of that support we can translate over to our respective institutions is going to be the next topic of workshop. And because we are a little bit over time, I do want to make sure that we contextualize this conversation as one that we want to keep fostering throughout the day. So where do I stand in relation to this movement, to this ultimate goal of greater inclusivity and immigrant rights? And to that end, even though ideally we would be able to answer this in this particular space and time, throughout the day, these are the following reflection questions that I think Professor Nahid and I would encourage you all to consider. So as we've talked about, as you've seen some of your colleagues and peers from these other institutions kind of come to terms and grapple with how they negotiate their own labels and identities, we want you to consider how are the labels that you see in your everyday world, how are they operational, so currently practice, so this idea of who defines and describes as what versus aspirational, the type of language that we want to continue to see, right? So if you feel that terms like dreamer are actually creating a dichotomy that isn't expanding the movement but decreasing it, how do we talk about this idea of changing that language?